Alright, hey everyone. In today's video, I want to talk about a bit of going from boxes for practicing and kind of like learning the sort of about three-dimensional and sort of like that objects take up space and sort of like transitioning into drawing characters. So these are a bit of the drawings that I did earlier pretty much in the last week or two, and just a bunch of kind of drawings that I did on stream. So I figured I would show you guys quick before I get into the video. And I'll kind of basically show you guys from my own personal experience, sort of how you guys could transition from boxes to characters. I sort of did it backwards and didn't really practice much at all for boxes, and just kind of went straight into drawing characters. And yeah, so I kind of am more familiar with the drawing characters part. And really I started doing that mostly because I I didn't really see too much like practical use for drawing a box like after a certain point of practicing it. And kind of what I mean by that is I think that boxes are like a great way to initially like explain that things take up space and that there are like basically four different planes on like a very basic level to something. So if I was going to do a box in space, and this was how my box turned out. Then we have our box, and I should have done this in red. But then we have our box, and what I kind of noticed was drawing characters within the box is really good for figuring out sort of like how the character is going to sit in this space. And I kind of like to imagine it as some kind of like weight on the character. So if everything is sort of like basically like gravity, if gravity is kind of like compressing this character into like a dense form, that's kind of where the box really describes that well. So if I was going to draw a face in this box, the brow line would kind of like line up on this front plane, and we would get into the head. And then basically like the box is very like about planes. And so I think the key part is that like the eyes will be on the front plane of the face. So the eyes will like just barely start to go back, and your ears on the side. So it's a lot about like the planes and sort of like where things don't go past or where things do go past. And when I'm drawing inside of the box, I'm kind of like, for me personally, I'm not thinking too much about the box. I'm just kind of drawing the character. Otherwise, he's gonna look very weird since I'm not used to drawing in a box. And that's kind of where the big thing is that comes out of this is I think familiarity is very important, and whatever you're practicing, you're going to get better at that specific thing. So if you're practicing a lot of boxes, you'll get very good at practicing boxes, but it might not transition very well into then drawing faces, because to kind of like practice and get better at drawing faces, you have to draw like faces. I know it sounds very obvious in that way, But yeah, so the boxes definitely have a use. I think they sort of cap out on what you can kind of gain from it once you understand like the concepts of it and sort of like why. I think that's really the key to like a lot of the fundamentals or things that you might be like guided towards to learn or attracted in other people's artwork and things is sort of like, why is this a thing that I'm told to learn, and sort of like what use does it have? And yeah, I'm kind of correcting some of the parts here, but yeah, so I kind of like to think about like, why is this useful? Sort of like, what use does it have for my characters? And kind of like, will this be useful for my end goal? So I think it's really important to kind of think about what your end goal is and like the practical uses for it. So we have this character inside of the box, and I think the box is really good to figure out position as well. And I think it really depends on how you use it. And I think this could be like a really good transition to drawing your characters. And so, yeah, we have this character here. And he started off as a box. And for also shading the boxes, like a very useful simplification, since we kind of know that, well, now the thing is, we went from a box to like a more complicated shape. So now his head is round, and he's got different shapes. His eyes are more of like a crevice, so they sink in a bit on the ridge. So that's why he has shadow in it. And the nose is sort of turning as we have the roundness of his head here. So this kind of brings up a few other things of how it gets a little bit complicated, because instead of going from like a more simple like mannequin head, we have basically just added a bunch of features. But really, it's still the same sort of thing, where as if I was shading this, if I was shading more of like a mannequin head that is a square, this whole half right here would just all be in shadow. But when we go to a character, we have basically more complicated shapes. So we're doing this action here of shading like one form, but we're doing it like maybe 50 times or 30 times throughout the face on a bunch of different of these sort of little parts. And it really depends on how intense you go with it. You could definitely still do like a shadow setup that's very simple, especially starting off, if that helps you sort of transition. Sorry, I have to pause to get more ink on the brush. But yeah, so from, if we're doing a more simple form, which is basically just taking the square itself and moving it over here, which is still the same exact thing as having our character within a box. And I've kind of naturally lined up these floors, and that's kind of an important thing whenever I'm drawing characters in space is like having the characters match each other. So it doesn't really matter what mistake you make on where you're setting up the characters like alignment in space. If you sort of match the alignment with the rest of your characters will then sit in like an environment that kind of all works together. So if this is his center going through, and then basically this is his center going through this way. So what I could do from here is I have like two options. I could make the arrow like warp, and then basically a lot of characters will match out of it. Like I will do that. So I could have had it a similar thing, but now it's like a bit warped and more of an up tilt as we go up. So really drawing the characters in the boxes sort of helps with space and positioning of your characters. And if your goal is like more of a scene, I think the boxes can really help get familiarity and feel with sort of like the depth in the scene. And I like to practice more of the characters themselves. So I never really practiced like the boxes. So my characters might look a little rough drawing inside of these boxes since I'm just not practiced in drawing inside of a box. But I have practiced like many hours and years drawing just characters themselves. So that's kind of my familiarity and comfort zone that's built up. So that's kind of what I guess I have seen the most growth at because of that. And so we can do the same thing. This character. And then if you're transitioning from boxes and you're kind of like very good at doing that, and you want to start doing more complicated forms, if you can kind of think of you're sculpting out the character, and doing this will result in some like kind of wonky looking people, I feel like, because the square is just not a very natural form for the head at all. Like the head is very rounded like this, and so drawing like a face without the box, which whenever I'm drawing, I don't think of the box whatsoever. I like to think of these forms, or basically like markers. So I have the brows, and this basically tells me where this line is on my box. So equivalent would be about here. So with the brow, I now know sort of like in space, not necessarily like within a box, in space of where my character is going to sit with his brows. Because a face is not very like a box at all. The box is more of a simplification of just space and sort of the planes. So when I'm drawing a face, there are a lot more intricacies and a lot more variety in sort of people's faces, and a lot of faces are not symmetrical, they're not lined up, sometimes they're uneven. So there's a lot of room to sort of like experiment with and have fun. And that's kind of like why I wanted to make this video, really, is that if you're maybe like a little burnt out and you feel like drawing boxes is the only way to sort of learn how to draw from imagination, or just kind of like make your characters a lot better, I always suggest, kind of just from my own experience, to sort of like jump in to drawing just characters or basically whatever your goal is. If your goal is to do like comics or that sort of thing, or you want to draw characters from imagination, then kind of jumping into that as soon as you kind of like understand the concepts of that things sort of take up space, and you can really do things in whatever order you want. Just because someone says or suggests a certain thing doesn't mean you need to follow it to a T. You can always kind of test what works best for you and sort of see, like, is this usable for what I am trying to achieve in my everyday? And I always kind of like to, like, especially myself, I like to test out whenever I see something in a movie, like a specific scene, and I want to kind of like mimic it, or not really mimic it, but sort of like find what made that scene interesting to me, and then see if that will even work for me, because some things just don't really work with sort of my intentions and sort of what I want to achieve. So drawing a face and a character like this is a lot more natural for me, and I'm playing off of more of features and familiarities that I've sort of like gotten more familiar with over time and just kind of like expanded on. So I'm not thinking of a box whatsoever. I am literally just drawing a character and going down his body. And for the alignments, is the twist kind of happens once the face is more like rounded. So we don't really have too much of this like flat frontal, even though it's still there. A much more important one, in my opinion, is more of this turning sort of thing that is happening. And you could kind of picture it as more of like a cylinder or a tube, and that will sort of, the top will be there and the bottom there, and this is looking more upward. So whenever I practice is just basically drawing characters, and I know that might seem like a bit of a jump going from, just practicing characters right away without the box, and it might be a little like not what you want straight off the bat, but I think the sooner you can sort of get used to all these different changes, because even like a piece of clothing, this sort of like, or we have his shoulder. Let's do some kind of action with him. So I'll add the shadow, and that will kind of add a bit of like the roundness. And this is something that the square or the box kind of doesn't have. And if you first heard that, you might think, well, the square, oh, then I should draw like spheres or something. And that could help as well. But a lot of the simple shapes sort of just fall off at a certain point, because the human body and a lot of things that exist in our world are just not very simple shapes. Yes, they can be like simplified into simple shapes, but they're not very simple. And I think kind of getting used to how the actual like subject is and its sort of intricacies and specific like shapes and sort of things. If you can get used to that by repetition and messing around, sort of like experimenting, and really it all comes down to what you're interested in and sort of your enjoyment. So if you like drawing boxes and that's sort of like meditative and fun for you, then you might get more out of drawing boxes like across the page in different spots and that sort of thing. Like if you get a lot of enjoyment out of drawing and sort of just like feeling out the space on the page, and if this is sort of what you like, then you'll probably get a lot of like mileage and value out of that. And that might be like the way to go. And then like really test it and see how it works for you, because that might be a better option than trying to transition into characters themselves. But there are just so many different ways and routes to kind of go about learning art. And I liked to just kind of like go straight into characters, because this is what I had the most fun doing. And this is sort of how I learned, was starting with the characters and kind of like building like piece by piece and sort of getting better each time with it. And I think whatever route you go will probably still have that like training, I guess, of each time you do it, you get a little bit better each time. And so we will have the character's arm. And I want him to have it coming across. And especially this point, thinking about, I'll sort of do another demonstration after this, but I also wanted to talk about sort of breaking beyond the box and kind of making characters not stiff, which a box is relatively a stiff like form on its own, so it kind of almost will favor that if you're drawing inside of it. And this video is nothing against drawing boxes. I think they're like, for explaining drawing and sort of like different aspects, I think it's definitely one of the most efficient ways to like explain certain things in like the most simplistic way, which is kind of why it's like talked about so much in art. And then we'll have his sword. All right. So now we have our character here. And I'll have this other arm coming down and sort of balancing the sword on that lower part. Right. And really, I think if sort of like your goal is to draw from imagination and characters, I think it can be really beneficial if I think it sort of takes like a bit of a certain mindset to go the route that I did and draw characters straight off the bat from imagination and sort of like learn from that. I think that it's a little bit difficult maybe, but it might work well for like certain people. It just kind of like depends on like I guess your goals and maybe a bit of personality as well. But that is kind of just the way that I've learned. Alright. And then yeah, so we have our character here. And really I think sort of like transitioning from the boxes sooner than later once you sort of like understand that things sort of like sit in these different columns. And you don't even really need to know that they sit in different columns. You'll sort of like get that feeling out. And drawing in this sort of way where it's like directly the character first and building off of that kind of takes like a lot of experimental drawing and really to practice sort of like drawing the boxes in different spaces. And that kind of concept, I'll show sort of how I go about practicing that. And it's pretty much the same exact concept as, so we have these boxes and we're drawing them in space. We're drawing these boxes in space. And let's say we have our box here and we want to draw one that's a bit further back in perspective. I should grab a different color now. Alright, so we want to draw, that's not much different. We want to draw a different box that is going back in space and kind of watching these planes on the floors. And so this one was a little bit wonky with my lines on the plane of the floor. So I kind of just matched that on the next one. And so when you make mistakes, which is pretty bound to happen eventually, I sort of like to balance it out. So even if I'm a little bit off, everything is still very consistent. And I think that the consistency matters much more than the accuracy, really. So then I sort of have this going through of my characters, and it's going back and shooting out that way. So I have a bit of a pushback here going on with the boxes. And I've also kind of, in a way, determined where my shadows are being placed by this sort of plane on this box. So my light is hidden from this direction and the shadows are basically, I like to also think of it hidden from the opposite direction. And really shadow and light is sort of the same thing. They're like whenever I'm going to shade, or if you're painting, you might do highlights, and it's basically still the same thing, except more often the light will come from above and the shadows from below, and like more of a like on average scenario. Alright, so if I was practicing boxes, I would sort of just keep placing them in different areas over there. And then if I am doing the characters, and this might be an easy way to transition, or not necessarily easy, but a way to sort of do it. And so I used to draw boxes, at least like for the first few days that I was practicing. I would sort of like just put them in areas, but it wasn't very interesting for me. And I didn't feel like it was helping me draw characters. So instead, I just started drawing characters. And so the same sort of concept, everything is pushing this way. So our next character, I'll have him on the other side of the sword so he's a bit easier to see. But then I basically, if this was just a normal everyday drawing, then I would just start up and start on my next character. And I like to start on the brow since it's very easy and I'm used to that. And it helps set up the eyes pretty well. And then basically just working down the character. I always like to, like, I don't know, that's basically how I do the characters, is a very like working across the details and going through. And you definitely don't need to draw like this. You don't need to use a brush or anything that I'm doing or you see other people do. It's just kind of like personally, I just like how ink and water feels, and I like a lot of like Chinese and Japanese like old ink paintings, which is kind of why I use a brush. And so I'm just like working down the character, going a little bit further. And sort of like sculpting out the face. I don't really know how I want to do him yet. And at this point, I think I will add a mask to him to kind of just add a bit of another layer. And that's kind of where I would suggest transitioning out of the boxes. It's just a lot of these different, very specific shapes that will come up that are just very different than sort of what the box allows you to practice. And I think the faster you can kind of jump into these like odd shapes that come up on a lot of different things, like folds on clothes can be a bit crazy for sort of like trying to make it all in perspective, or something organic like water. They can definitely still like be in perspective. Like if I was going to do let's say like a water wave, it definitely can still follow perspective, and we can still have it sort of be in this box or space, really. And I guess that's kind of like a key part, is kind of thinking of the box as more so space than kind of attaching like a specific idea of the box. All right, so we have this character. And as I start adding armor and a lot of different features here, it sort of becomes hard to even think about a box at this point. Like it's a bit too taxing on my brain trying to think of, oh, am I in the right point on my grid line or any of like those sorts of things. Like it's just too much detail and different stuff to think about at one time. So really I do it in this way to sort of simplify that as much as possible. And it's just sort of like an action of drawing at this point. and it's just kind of like sort of like in the zone, I guess, of just kind of creating something. And that's really what I like to do when I draw, is just kind of create what I can and different characters and play around and experiment, sort of find out what I like about different things and kind of see what I can really create. And doing this armor can get a little bit complicated, but I'm using all of the detail as I would to sort of make these planes, and I'm following the form of the character rather than the form of a box. And this kind of allows me to be very creative and spontaneous as I'm drawing, and kind of just come up with things on the fly and be very adaptive and sort of like work through problems as they arise. And my brush is drying. I also think this is a much more natural progression, as it might seem like very unnatural at first, but more so as you might not just be used to drawing this way. And really, it all comes down to like familiarity and how used to something you are. And when you get more used to something, you will basically gain more control over it and more consistency and accuracy as well. So doing these characters, I sort of like get a natural progression and learning as well, where I have this character, I might not have liked certain aspects of his face, or maybe I just want to explore more on it by adding armor and different things. So I've taken a character that is very similar and I basically added him to the scene and changed up certain features to maybe basically like see how would he look in this scenario, or maybe with different hair or facial features, and just kind of work off of that idea and add it onto my next one. So personally, I think this is like way more interesting in the fun part of drawing and sort of the reason that I draw. So that's why I practice in this sort of way rather than drawing from the boxes. And if you're just starting off in your drawing adventure, definitely don't compare. Well, I think comparison is a good thing for art, but there's kind of two ways that it can be taken. It can be taken in a very negative aspect, and it can be taken in a positive. And I think the positive way to take comparison is more so like if you see someone that does something that's very cool, or you want to create something that's very similar. I think if you can sort of take it as that person was able to achieve something that I didn't know was possible or want to achieve, I think that can be sort of a motivator. But I definitely think also kind of realizing that to achieve what a certain person that you like achieved, it's going to require like a certain amount of time also invested. So I think if you can sort of accept in a way that it's going to sort of take time to develop to a certain point with your art, I think it will sort of help a lot with the practicing sort of aspect. And every day that I go to draw, I'm practicing, but it's in this way where I'm creating like scenes of characters and different things that I find sort of interesting or enjoyable, and I'm practicing and basically building onto these like genres of characters like samurai and orcs and different things like that, and kind of like building off of those concepts and like experimenting with samurai armor and building off of sort of the different ways that I could make the samurai armor rather than kind of like different positioning for boxes and different things like that. So this is just kind of how I've learned drawing. It's a very um I don't know, independent way, I guess, where everything is kind of learned off of your own world that you design. And so everything is sort of progressed off of itself. So I guess it's more of a self-sufficient way where it's not really like learned from books and different things. And I feel like if you are really hardcore like studying art and you are learning from a lot of videos and books, which is sort of like how I started, there reaches a certain point, or at least for me, there reached a certain point to where it became um, almost repetitive in what I could gain from the videos or books, and a lot of the themes will sort of just start to repeat, and I couldn't find any new information. So I kind of like ran into a bit of a like problem to where I didn't feel like I could progress much because everything like I felt like I already kind of like understood the basics of what was being guided or explained on. So to go out from there, I kind of realized that I would have to basically learn from my own experience, which is kind of why I started practicing in this way, because I kind of realized that for me to go any further, I was gonna have to go and experience everything for myself and kind of like see if a lot of what I learned could be implemented in a way that kind of suited me, or if I could do it in a usable way. So, yeah, this is pretty much the exact same as drawing boxes, but in a more, for me, interesting way, and kind of doing more so of what I originally wanted to do for drawing, and sort of, I guess, the whole reason of why I wanted to practice drawing was to get to this point of being able to draw characters from imagination and like a three-dimensional scene. And really, I kind of realized that to get to a point where I'm drawing characters from a scene from imagination, I really just need to do that that single act itself, and from there everything will just kind of pan out, and I will just learn from every iteration I do, every scene that I make of characters is basically all of the mistakes and things are right there for me to then learn from and grow really. So yeah, if I was gonna continue the scene, I would probably fill the entire page with a bunch of characters, and pretty much I've kept like everything sort of in line, and that's kind of just like over time I've sort of built up like the familiarity with how things sit in space. So this is like a an angle that I'm quite comfortable with. So if I really wanted to continue, these characters are pretty much still sitting in the space. And even though a lot of like when I go to draw the boxes, which I'm not as familiar with, the boxes might not be as lined up, but the thing I am familiar with is the characters. So my characters are a lot more lined up than than the boxes are from just personal experience. So if I wanted to go, I could come through here and basically continue on from where I started with these other characters. And just start continuing on to them. And I guess if this sort of helps for drawing over your characters, and kind of if this helps placing objects on your character and sort of like working from that, and you don't want as much of a like build up, then yeah, that could also work. There's really infinite amount of ways to go about learning. It's just kind of finding out what specifically works best for you, which might take a bit of time to kind of learn about yourself really, or about different genres or things that you're interested in. And it kind of took me a while to learn like what is a fun way to draw. And it took me a long time to sort of figure out a specific drawing process that I would find fun. Like I saw Kim Jong-gi draw, and I tried to do something similar and basically figure out like the why, I guess. Like anytime you like an artist or are inspired by an artist, if you can kind of figure out why they do certain things, sometimes there might just not be a reason, and it might just be like intuition, or they've always done something similar, so they might not know. But kind of the why, like for using a brush, I practiced like 3 years with a brush and not really even knowing what about a brush. Like I didn't really know why I was practicing with a brush other than it looked cool when I saw other people using brushes and ink. And it took me like 3 years of drawing with a brush to sort of like figure out the pros and cons or different aspects that I liked about the brush over like other drawing mediums and different things. So it can definitely take a lot of like of your own experimenting and figuring out like what is it about certain things. You know, whenever I'm watching a movie and I find certain scenes to be interesting, I'm always trying to figure out like what was it about the scene that was interesting. Like it might not be the what you see right away. It might be something that you don't see, or maybe it's just like a personal attachment or something like that. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything for this video. It's a bit of a long one, but I feel like there is maybe a lot of helpful information about it. But yeah, I just wanted to make sort of a video about boxes, and I think they're a great starting point. And I don't think they're like everything to drawing. I think there's a lot. It goes way deeper than just drawing boxes, because there's so many things to life really that are a bit more complicated and a bit more difficult to draw. Like, but boxes are sort of a way to simplify how something will sit in space. And we have like cylinders and spheres as well. So if it helps you to simplify it, to understand it, I think that's really the key point of the fundamentals and simplifying everything. But yeah, I really like to sort of go and practice the actual idea of the thing, and really learn specifically what that idea has, and sort of like samurai armor and different things, which I think helps me sort of learn very quickly, because I'm always looking for these sort of aspects that really make that thing what it is. Like what makes a samurai look like a samurai versus some other type of warrior from history and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that's going to do it for this video. I know it's a bit of a long one, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. I don't know if you guys are interested in any of my originals that I've showed in the earlier part of the video or anything else. You can email me at brycecalendarart@gmail.com, and currently all of my originals are going for $25 each. And yeah, or you can also, I'm also open for custom work if you're interested in having me draw a specific thing. So yeah, you can email me about that, but that's gonna do it for this video.